Welcome to the Third Degree Masonic Podcast, where we are always on the level. We're your hosts. I'm Brother Samuel.
I'm Brother Gabriel.
And we're just a couple of Masons trying to find our place in this fraternity. Craftsman, if you've ever been to a Masonic lodge, you know that we have some historical idols that we look up to. Men who paved the way in history, not only for our country, for civics, but also for the fraternity, and have laid the groundwork and the cornerstones for what the fraternity is built on today. But what do we really know about some of these icons in Masonry? Well, Craftsman, we're going to take a deep dive into a couple of them in this 3-part series. And when it's done, I think you're going to learn some really interesting things about a couple of founding fathers that I bet you didn't know. On today's episode, we will be looking into the man, the myth, the legend and hero of the American Revolution, Brother George Washington. But first, a couple of housekeeping things. Craftsman, we are looking forward to jumping back into our next question series. It's really cool. We have some amazing guests getting lined up. It's going to be great. But for now, for the summer, we just wanted to do a couple of projects that we're pretty passionate about. We've been working on for a while. And we'll come back to you with that question here really soon. So, also, Gabe has something he would like to say.
Hey, Craftsman, Brother Gabriel here. On behalf of the Third Degree Masonic Podcast, we would just like to put out an announcement to our craftsmen and listeners. Brothers, for those of you who have filled out the surveys in the past, please take some time to check your spam folders and your junk folders in your email. The podcast has been sending out several emails to the winners of our survey, and we would like those individuals to get into contact with us as soon as they are able to. On behalf of the Third Degree Masonic Podcast, we really appreciate everyone who has been putting in the surveys, and in the future, we will have yet again another raffle, and we're very much looking forward to it. Again, Craftsmen, just to reiterate, please get in contact with us if you filled out a survey. Check your spam folder. We would like to get in touch with the brothers who won the hats from Mason Gear.
Perfect. So let's get on to this awesome episode. So, Brother Gabriel.
So, Brother Wilburn.
Who do you think is probably the most prominent Masonic figure in our fraternity? I mean, if you had to pick our mascot.
In America?
In America. Specifically American Freemasonry.
Specifically American Freemasonry. Well, there's Charlie Murphy. There's Mark Allred.
That's true. Those are good options.
Those are definitely good options.
But what about for the whole country?
For the whole country. You know, I think we have a portrait of this guy in our lodge.
Oh, we do. We absolutely
have. I think we have multiple portraits.
We have one that's hanging in the doorway as you come up the steps. It's huge.
Yes, and then there's a bust painting too of him.
Yep.
I believe he was our first president.
I think
he's on the dollar bill.
Yeah. Craftsman, we're talking obviously about Brother George Washington. I think most Masons know, and even a lot of non-Masons know, that Brother Washington was a very, very proud Freemason. But what's interesting is he was not I would argue he's not your stereotypical Mason. He's not, the life he lived was very Masonic, but he had a very interesting Masonic career. And a lot of people don't know that a lot of his beliefs in his life came from Freemasonry, and vice versa. They kind of affected one another. So what do you know about Brother Washington's early life?
Well, as a aspiring, really hobbyist historian, I know a lot about his later life in terms of his military career and his political career, but I don't know as much as some other historians and other people who deep dive into this about his early life.
Absolutely. And I will tell you this much, we are not a history podcast. There are much better historians out there. But just on a very basic sense. So I want you to envision, so George grew up in a somewhat affluent family, right? His family wasn't super duper rich. His father had been married twice. He was the second set of children. He had older siblings that were older than him from his dad's first marriage. So he was not the first in line to take over the family, the family estates. His older brother was. George, for the most part, while he came from a very well-to-do family, he did not receive the same kind of education that his siblings did. He, more or less, from what I can understand, he was very self-taught. He taught himself a lot when it came to education, virtue, manners, geometry, trigonometry. He was very active in self-teaching himself because he had to. And he became a surveyor and worked really hard at a really young age to take care of his family and siblings because he wasn't the well-to-do side of the family. They weren't starving by any means, but they were the cousins, the family that you when you see them, they're like, oh yeah, that's my family over there. But I mean, his older brother kind of took care of him, but he wasn't the master of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So by happen chance, his older brother passed away, and also his older brother's daughter. That left no heir to the family, and he inherited Mount Vernon. And with it, all the property, and all the farming property. And he was fascinated in learning how to be a farmer and growing tobacco and working on all of his crops. On top of all that, with his military career that I'm sure you can fill me in a little bit better. But based off of what I can understand from Brother Washington, he kind of was given an opportunity to have all the things that he didn't have growing up, and he wasn't going to squander it. And he kind of self-taught himself in all kinds of ways to try and further himself, to be better than he really should have been.
Sounds like a man with a good foundation.
Correct. Going back to what we've talked about, he had a good foundation. And what's really interesting is and we'll get more into his Masonic career a little bit later, he actually petitioned the lodge at 21 years old. So he was a little bit older than most Masons can join nowadays, but I believe you can probably tell me more as a hobbyist historian. 21 years old back in those times was a lot older than what it would be now, correct?
Yeah, debatably, depending on what region, what time period you're looking at and all that mumbo jumbo, but it was considered a higher level of maturity than it would be now.
Right. So he was, older.
Yeah, he was he would be the equivalent of a, not middle-aged guy, but definitely in the adult category.
Like our age, kind of?
Yeah.
Like in almost in his 30s at that point.
Yeah, the equivalent of probably.
He's now running Mount Vernon. He's got all this property. He's finally kind of a to-do person, and he chose to join the lodge. Some people argue he did it for the social clout. I mean, you got to think back then, being a Mason was a lot different than it was now. A lot of these guys that were joining Masonry back then, it wasn't a lot of the poor farmers or I'm sure they had the everyday man, but a lot of these guys that were in the colonial lodges were well-to-do off because they were the ones that could take the time off to go to Masonic events.
It was still, at that time, it was still very Anglican style, very reminiscent of UK lodges, Scottish lodges.
Yes. And you had to prove your place back then. They lodges back then did not have 75 members. It was 15, 20 guys. I mean, they were meeting in taverns and in caves and pretty much wherever they could have. They didn't have dedicated lodge spaces, not usually. So to be able to have these, a big lodge like that requires the numbers. They didn't have them. But they also were teaching I would say a more full-blooded Masonic education back then.
Yeah, it's one of the weird, like, taking good things about how they did it in the past and comparing it to nowadays, because you can't really compare the two. But back then, there was such an emphasis on knowing your ritual, knowing the symbolism, embracing the teaching. Like,
I think there was more of a culture to it too.
Yeah, and also there was no such thing as a minimum proficiency back then. You had to do everything verbatim in full form.
Talking to each other.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also back then, I think they took some of the tenets of being an entered apprentice a little bit more seriously, being a fellow craft more seriously. I think they were all based on your merits when you were there, how much you did for the lodge or what you knew moving forward. Which is just fascinating to me, because when you start talking about some of the masonry, like the style of masonry that they did back then versus now, they used to do table lodges and festive boards like monthly. Maybe not monthly, but more regularly than we do. I mean, we look at a festive board or a table lodge as we do it as a yearly event, and that everyone's like, here we go, I got to drink 1 million cups of orange juice and do this. These guys traveled, sometimes 50 miles to break bread with their brothers and have toasts and to talk about the fraternity and enlightenment and to be with each other. And they braved limb and body and, pneumonia. We're talking about a time where if you got a splinter, you could die. So it's pretty impressive that these guys would go through all of this effort, right? So Washington joined, obviously, as a young man. He has everything he's got going for him, and I believe he took a commission in the military, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to describe from a modern sense, because back then military commissions worked way differently than they work now. But yes, he took a low-level commission because he hadn't gone to any academy. He hadn't gone to any prominent military school. I mean, West Point wasn't a thing yet, or if it was, it wasn't the academy and establishment that it would become. But he was basically in the British Army version of the Survey Corps kind of thing like that. It was a very low-level type position.
Right, but he ended up kind of being in some really, at a very young age, being involved in some very important situations.
So the devoted part-time soldier, part-time historian, full-time patriot, and full-time lodge member, I don't mean any offense to Brother Washington, but none of us start out perfect.
No.
Brother Washington, as much as I hate to say it, was not a very competent military commander when he first started his military career.
In fact, we had just found out recently that he, in a roundabout way, caused a war with France. I didn't know
There's
this.
a little bit more nuance to it, and that war was going to happen eventually. But yes,
he's the blame, though.
There is some merit to the claim that George Washington and a mistranslated document started the French and Indian
War. Which is fascinating.
Which is also technically the 7 Years' War, which is technically the world's first global war, and it gets really complicated from there.
Essentially, during his commission, he was sent to, were they investigating the land, or were they sent there to talk to the French?
A little bit of both.
And he had a Native American guide with him, and the Native American guide had ulterior motives, and when they went to go talk to the French, he killed some of the Frenchmen, and essentially at the end of the day, that Frenchman turned out to be a diplomat to France. And the French retaliated with extreme prejudice and locked him and his guys down in a fort in the middle of nowhere. And Washington made some of the worst military decisions tactically you could make. Even today, you're looking at the situation and you're like, oh, it's really bad. You'd look up Fort Necessity and you'll see what we're talking about.
You'll see it.
But he ended up having a ceasefire and a surrender. And to surrender, they let them leave, but he had to sign documents talking about what they did. And their translator did not speak very good French. He was a Dutchman.
Yeah, he only spoke German, Dutch, and English.
He didn't really know French. And essentially, Washington was tricked into signing a document that said that he assassinated the French diplomat, and that's what kind of started off the war.
And then the war spirals out of control,
right. And like you said, it was going to happen anyway. But this was the match that lit the hay
This was
barn.
a catalyst. And what's interesting is when Washington returned, his commission was
gone.
Well, yeah, the British Army, because
he embarrassed the king.
It was weird how it worked at the time, because at the time it was like there was and wasn't a federal government in the colonies. It was the crown was the federal government, but there were different levels of it, and it's hard to explain. So his commission was actually through the British government. So the British government rescinded his commission, but then he joined his state's militia.
Yeah.
So it would be basically like he was a
federal service. And
like he was an army captain, and then he went to the National Guard and became a lieutenant. That's
right.
kind of the modern day equivalent of that situation.
But he took this loss on, he accepted it, and instead of wallowing in self-pity from it, he learned.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And in his way of doing things, what we talk about him being self-taught in so many ways, he began to self-teach himself military tactics, how to be a leader. And it's insane, to see on one side you have this man that we hold up in such high regard for what he did during the American Revolution, a reluctant hero. In a way, he wasn't really all that thrilled to be made the commander of the military for the revolution.
And in fact, at the time, there were a lot of people who were very angry because there were more skilled, more experienced commanders. Well, it's kind of hard to describe the situation at the time, but...
Well, so why was he chosen, Gabe?
So... You'll have to forgive me for a second because I'm trying to pour through a whole bunch of information, and some of it may be anecdotal, some of it may be outdated information, some of it may be pure propaganda.
Just summarize.
So basically what it was is that Virginia was a powerhouse of both economics and the spirit of independence and manpower, and just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And the Virginia legislature, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but made him the commander of the Virginia militia. And just because they kind of were the largest, he then became the de facto leader, and then proved himself through tactics and battles and political friends and political acquaintances, wound up being the appointee to the First Continental Congress, the appointee of the head of the Continental Army.
So he's became the John Connor of the American Revolution.
Kind of. There's more to it. He was at some of the original Continental Congress hearings and some of the original Virginia delegations and stuff like that. So it's a much bigger story, but that's
Right.
someone else who knows a lot more than I do can cover all the specifics.
That's true. And like I said, we are not full-time historians here. But what I will tell you I find fascinating is some of the stories that you can hear and read about Washington and his virtue, right? So we're talking about a man here. So, we all grew up, I think we all heard the story of George Washington chopped down the cherry tree and he couldn't tell a lie. So then he told his father and, blah, 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 blah. That's not true. I mean, that's a cute fairy tale to tell children, but that's not true. What is true, though, is the amount of virtue that this man had. He had morals. His moral compass was unshakable. His people often described him as stoic, not rather boisterous, very kept to himself, very decorum. He very, very much was a man of decorum. But he had his morals and his beliefs and his thoughts on things, and while they could change, his moral compass did not. He had a very strong sense of what right and wrong was. But he also had an understanding of things that were in his control and not in his control. So he made an effort in his life to try and fix the things that he could control, but the stuff that he wasn't, he was very adamant about putting things in there about. A lot of his writing talks about things that he wishes he could change, a lot of things he wishes he could fix, but they were out of his control. One big prominent one, we don't want to talk about it too much, but he had a lot of strong feelings about slavery, which at the time he was in his life, there was nothing he could do about it. It was just what it was. One man wasn't going to change everything. But he felt so strongly about it when he died that he freed all of his slaves and left them in his will that they should be taken care of and their heirs should be taken care of from Mount Vernon. So, interesting concept, you know what I mean? It's just something to think about. The man stuck to his morals on a lot of...
And it's hard when you get into a topic like that because there's moral revisionism, there's historical revisionism,
right.
And at the time, the fact of reality is that at the time it was not seen as a bad thing,
right? But it's nice to know. It's nice to know that he knew that it was, and that he, even if it was a symbolic gesture at the end of his life, it's more than most men did, and I think it sets a precedent of. That was like a change in his mindset, hey, this isn't right. This isn't the right thing to do. And I'm going to do this. So I respect that about him. Like you said, it's a different time, a different place, and it's not a topic I want to cover. It's not my place to do so. But I think that's fascinating. What I also find fascinating is the amount of hobbies that this man had. He was into everything. Like, I thought I was bad when it came to hobbies. Brother Washington I don't know how he had time to do anything. He made an effort to become, when he was done with the military career and his intentions after the Revolutionary War, which didn't end up happening, and really didn't end up happening too much until after he was president, he enjoyed farming. Not only did he enjoy farming, he enjoyed coming up with new ways to grow crops, exploratory scientific methods on building, like growing crops and tobacco. And it's fascinating kind of reading some of the stuff about how he would organize his fields so that way they would grow in a way so that way the following year they would continue to grow based off of where the wind and the water was taking the crops. It was insane. But on top of all this, he loved horse riding, gambling, horse races, fox hunting, cards, drinking, and masonry. He had so many hobbies. I mean, it's like the equivalent of me. Like, I'm over here, you're like, oh, what are you doing today? Well, I got the podcast. Then I got to go riding with my motorcycle buddies. And then I thought I had a lot of hobbies, but I think Brother Washington takes the cake on it.
It's that is pretty interesting, and people always tell me that I do too much, but now I can just come back at them with well, George Washington had a lot of hobbies, so it's okay if I do.
But now that we've talked a little bit about the man himself, right? We've talked about a little bit of his moral compass, right? We're talking about an infallible man, strong opinions, strong feelings. People followed this man because they believed in him, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we come back from this short break, I want to dig into his Masonic career because I tell you what, it is absolutely fascinating. So stay tuned, Craftsman. We'll be right back.
If you're in the market for even more Masonic content, check out our brothers from 357 Studio. Enjoy this short message from their host.
At Studio 357 Masonic Podcast, we consider ourselves to be the blue-collar Masons. We're not professionals, we're not very well-spoken, but we are 100% genuine in every show that we put out. Every Mason has a story, and we want to help tell it. We are available in video versions on YouTube and Spotify, and audio versions just about everywhere else. Please follow us on our socials on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. We hope to see you on our show. Travel well, my brothers.
Welcome back, Craftsmen, to the Third Degree Masonic Podcast. You're back with Brother Samuel and Brother Gabriel. Welcome back, brother.
Yes, welcome back.
So before our break, we were talking about Brother Washington, right? We talked about a little bit of his military career, a little bit of his upbringing. I think a lot of us know why we respect him as a hero in our country. I mean, first official president, right?
Yeah.
First, he was a hero for the Revolutionary War. He set a lot of the precedent for how we treat the president nowadays and the things that the president does or doesn't do. But now I want to dig into his Masonic career, right? So we talked about earlier about how Brother Washington joined when he was 21 years old, right? So in equivalent days for us, in Ohio, you join Masonic lodges you can join Masonic Lodge at 19, right? And, a lot of people join a little bit older. And 19 is pretty young. I mean, it's a year after you can vote. You can't quite drink yet. You're still kind of considered a youth.
I mean, I don't think I joined until I was, 22, 23?
I joined when I was 19, so...
Yeah.
But, like I said, the door was opened on to us, We already knew where the door was. All we had to do was knock on it. We weren't looking for the door. We knew where it was. But Brother Washington went looking for the door. Some would argue to raise his social status, having just come into a large chunk of property and trying to kind of meet with people of his equal now. I don't like to think so. I think the way that this man lived his life, I think he was looking for like-minded people, not just to raise his social status, but to be around people that he truly cared about, people that thought like him.
And also it goes into it of that, even if that was part of it, what you see in how he approaches the world and his writings and his experiences show you that even if that was the case, it was changed. Something changed, evolved, developed, was taught through instruction into making him into a better man.
Well, it's fascinating. So if you look at some of his writings that he talks to other religious institutions, he was a pretty religious man. He was very private in his own religious beliefs. I believe he was Evangelion. And
I actually don't know what his...
A lot of people think he was a deist like me, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. But he was very good at giving people the respect for their religion that he believed. So he was very good about, like when he was talking to people of the Jewish faith, he would refer to their God as Jehovah. I think that's right. Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Whichever way he referred to in the chair when he was speaking to Native Americans, he would refer to their God as the Great Spirit. He showed them the respect of their religion. He didn't treat other people's religious beliefs like they were wrong because they weren't his own. That's a Masonic tenet. I mean, we all believe in, we talk about the great architect of the universe. It's a very roundabout way of saying whatever you believe created us, right? So
in certain way, we don't have to go into debating theology and philosophy.
Well, obviously not. But I mean, it's a way of not picking one. It allows the person praying to envision their own belief in what it is. Mm-hmm. It's a very roundabout, equal way of saying it. But Brother Washington carried that around with him. I mean, he obviously respected other people's beliefs. He was very open-minded when it came to dealing with that, not closed-minded. That's Masonic. What I also find fascinating is his willingness to learn and being self-taught, mm-hmm. especially in things like mathematics, tactics, geometry, manners, arithmetic. I just said math like 4 times. I just used a different word for it. But he's really smart. I mean, he really knew his math. I mean, he was a surveyor. So we're talking about a man who is self-taught in some of the hardest logical topics. I don't know a whole lot of people that sit down and learn military tactics for fun, except for you and maybe Brother Martin. But it's just fascinating to me when it comes to that. But he also made a habit of, when he was in the military, he would visit military lodges. So military lodges are a little bit different from your stereotypical lodges, right? So today you would meet in a big building that I'm sure is sitting in your town, and they have a meeting once or twice a month, and it's always in that one place, right? Military lodges moved around with the military regiments.
Which, and it's sometimes hard to track this because sometimes it was informal. Sometimes they were not chartered, and
it was just a bunch of Masons.
It was Masons who just got together.
And they sat in a cave somewhere, and they would have a lodge meeting in the best way that they could with, what they had. And there's no documentation of it, right?
Not always. I know there is historical evidence of actual chartered military lodges, but they're few and far between, and most evidence is always anecdotal evidence of a couple Masons who are officers meeting together. I mean, a lot of the stuff that comes out of that era is still the old-fashioned, like, chivalry stuff, but there is both real and anecdotal evidence of Masons treating Masons of the same and opposing side with respect and dignity. I know there is, not as commonly, but I know there is anecdotal evidence of British Masons treating colonial Masons with slightly better conditions if they were found to be prisoner, of that sort of stuff.
Right. So there was rights and benefits,
depending, yes.
Yeah. So we have a man who was pretty active in Masonry. He also, when he was president, laid the cornerstone for Washington, D.C. That was pretty cool. Mm-hmm. He did that in full Masonic regalia.
Yeah, that was a pretty much an entirely Masonic event.
Yes, which is really cool. I think that's probably the picture that we have sitting on our, I think that's the picture that's in our dining room as of him laying the cornerstone for that. There's also records of him going to St. John the Baptist feasts, just major big events. But are you ready for the crazy thing?
Let's hear it.
Brother Washington is only recorded as having been at 9 Masonic meetings in his entire life. What do you think about that?
Well, firstly, I'm going to have to say that it is potential that some of the records were lost or destroyed over time.
Sure.
However, it is kind of interesting to think of someone who is so big into Masonic ceremony and going to Masonic events and considering themselves a Mason, only having been officially, according to records we have access to, having only been at 9 stated meetings.
Right. Well,
in his entire Masonic career, which is, what, 30-ish years?
I believe so.
Little over, not quite 40, but a little over 30 years?
I think so. That sounds right. Well, think about it this way, though, right? So let's say you got a guy in your lodge. You raised him as Master Mason. He comes back 9 times. What would you say about that guy? You can be honest. I mean, let's just call it what it is. Let's call a spade a spade.
I mean, it depends, but I would probably fall guilty of assuming that brother is either
not using his working tools, right?
Not being as quite as devoted as I might be, or some of the other guys who are here every week are.
Right.
So,
but think about this way, though. So where Brother Washington lived at Mount Vernon, it was over 50 miles away from his home lodge.
Which today is not an issue, but back then was a...
Well, it is an issue, Gabe. The lodge is a mile from your house. Not even.
Yeah, not
and
even.
We can't get guys to show up now. You know, we have trouble getting guys to leave their house one town away to come have a meeting with us.
When they have cars.
And they have cars.
And a 50-mile journey back then would have been at least 2 or 3 days.
Easily 2 or 3 days. And you're hoping the whole time that you don't step on a rock and break your ankle and we got to put you down like a horse. I mean, it's insane. So it was going to lodge back then. You had to want it. Like, you know, you think our wives get mad at us now and we're like, hey, honey, I'm going to be at the lodge for a couple of hours. Could you imagine telling your wife, I'm going to be gone for the next 4 or 5 days.
Bye.
Bye. You know, could you imagine that?
No, not at all.
So there's good reason why. I would imagine he did not attend a lot of Masonic meetings per se, but he also did. He was master of his lodge for a hot minute there when they were transitioning from, I believe you were telling me from like a colonial lodge into the actual state lodge that they became.
Yeah, firstly, I want to say something. I challenge myself, as well as any of our listeners, to be a general and a president and a basically active celebrity going to Masonic, like, celebrity events, and also be able to make your home lodge's stated meetings. I mean, for goodness sake, our treasurer is at Grand Lodge right now as a Grand Lodge officer doing amazing work at the Grand Lodge, and we haven't seen him in
a hot minute,
in quite a while.
I mean, we have our group officers call every week, and he's in
he's still an active member of our lodge, still promoting our lodge and being part of the discussion, but
he can't make it home.
I challenge anyone who, and even myself, because I fall prey to seeing that only been to 9 stated meetings number and looking down on it, but I challenge you to hold your Masonic principles close to your heart while also being a military officer and a political leader and a celebrity all at the same time.
Well, and anecdotally, this is all anecdotal because, like I said, he's only recorded as going to 9 Masonic meetings, right? Anecdotally, when he was on his press tour after he became president, going out and about and meeting with all of the states at the time, it was said that he made an effort to try and make it to Masonic events while he was president of the United States. He would make an effort. He was very big on not showing favoritism, right? When he was president, he did his best to not show any kind of favoritism or look like he could be bought or persuaded. He was setting a precedent. He was the first of his kind. We didn't have anything for it, and he set that. He was very big about not blurring those lines, right? But according to some of the histories that I've read, he would go out of his way if he was in a town that was having a Masonic function. He would stop by, show his face, and then leave. And I would imagine maybe he was saying, "Listen, guys, don't listen. I'm here, but I'm not here." So
you saw nothing.
You saw nothing. But I think genuinely, from the more I learn about Brother Washington, I think he was he wasn't a Mason. If he was today, if we dropped Brother Washington in today's Masonry, and he did everything that he did then, he did now. Modern day, no culture shock, none of that. He only came to 9 Masonic meetings, went to as much functions, talked about the fraternity in such an uplifting manner. I would say that he would be considered a good Mason, but not an active Mason, right?
By modern standards, yes.
Right. I think he's a good man. I think he was a Mason who carried the tenets of Freemasonry outside of his lodge room. He's what we argued about in our last series, that you need to take what you're taught in lodge and take it outside of the room, right? Who cares how good of Masons we are from 7:30 to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday?
If we're not also good Masons.
Off the clock, out at work, and I think Brother Washington was a good Mason outside of. I think he probably would have been a great man regardless of the fraternity, but I think the fraternity helped kind of guide that moral compass as a young man should have growing up. And I think he found a kindred spirit with his brethren, being self-taught the way that he was and being able to rub shoulders with men that were much more educated than him. I mean, debatably, he was one of the most uneducated founding fathers that we have, but also one of the most respected, and became our country's first leader. It says a lot about a man.
Mm-hmm.
That educated men who are, so at that time, that was a big deal if you were an educated man. We take college degrees nowadays for granted, but back then, that wasn't the case. If you could do math,
if you
were a wizard.
Math, you're a wizard.
You were Gandalf, okay? So if you could read and write,
you were a prince among men.
You're a prince among men, and they said, "No, this guy is the guy we want," and he did.
I mean, it is kind of hard to not choose the guy who did through fire and steel win the ability to have that country.
Yes.
It's kind of hard not to choose that guy no matter what, but...
Well, and he also went above and beyond. Here's the other thing, is I believe he said no at first, because I think he was afraid of becoming... He didn't want us to turn into what we had just overthrown.
So there's a lot about that. There was, at the time, fringe beliefs of offering him a crown, and he said no. There were fringe beliefs of having him declared as basically like not emperor, but like a consul for life kind of thing, and he said no. And originally people wanted him to run for president, and then he said no. And
right.
and then he went on to do it, and then only serve one term, somewhat for health reasons, somewhat for personal reasons, somewhat for moral reasons, and also because things were way different back then.
Well, he was probably
now
tired.
Yeah.
I'm tired now, and I'm 30, and I'm not a war hero, a celebrity, a farmer. I'm not any of these things. I'm tired now. I can only imagine at a certain point, he's just sitting there, and he's like, "Can I go home now and play with my crops? I want to go hunt. I want to go race horses, drink, and gamble." I can't blame him.
No, I can't either.
At a certain point, every man has to say, "I've done enough."
Yeah. And I think he did enough.
But I find it absolutely fascinating that he had the opportunity to be king of America and he turned it down. How many men do you, like, how strong does your moral compass have to be that infinite power can be handed to you and you go, I'm good. No thanks. We just got rid of one of those.
Yeah.
Why are we going to do that again? How many politicians do you know of that could be would do that?
Zero.
The best guy.
Even the ones I like, I would not trust them to make the right decision on that.
So if we made you a god king, how would you feel about that? You will?
Unlimited power.
George Washington is Palpatine. There is
a timeline somewhere.
Yeah, there's a Star Wars movie I would watch. But yeah, no, I think Brother Washington was a perfect example of that guy who's really got a golden heart, that good base you were talking about, didn't have the time to spend all of his free time in Masonry being in, moving through the chairs and being this and being that. We're talking about a practical Mason who carried the teachings of Freemasonry outside of the lodge into his everyday life. It made him a great man, and then he took those ideals with his other brethren and the other founding fathers and spread them amongst the country and created this country that we have now that has, let's just face it, very strong Masonic undertones to it. That can't be a fluke, right? So I think Washington is the perfect example of that guy that you have in your lodge, that if you called him right now, he would come and he would help you with whatever you needed, but he's not going to be there on Tuesday night when you guys are doing your ritual practice. He's too busy. But if you need his help, he'll help you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's Brother Washington. But to conclude on things, unless you've got anything more, Brother Gabriel.
No, it's very interesting because when you look at hindsight of historical people, especially this is a major thing that plagues modern historians, is we look at everything that has come before now with the lens of today on when we're doing it. I really think modern historians have lost the ability to transplant themselves into history to kind of appreciate the magnitude of the things back then.
Right.
And I mean, the problem is we put George Washington on this pedestal, and he, for all intents and purposes, as someone who is a devoted patriot, someone who has a portrait of George Washington, who exemplifies everything this country stands for, who would live and die by the founding document, by the Constitution. Brother Washington, President Washington, is still a man. He is still a vulnerable, mistake-making, imperfect ashlar.
Right.
But he did take steps in his life through his Masonic career to attempt to become the perfect ashlar.
Right.
And to kind of go back to our episode on that as long as you are doing that, as long as you are actively attempting that process, you are a good Mason.
I agree. I strongly agree. And I think Brother Washington was a phenomenal Mason. I mean, especially considering the times and who he was and what we've got going on. What will be interesting is when we talk about our next icon of Masonry that we are going to kind of compare him to, he's kind of the opposite of Brother Washington. We are going to be talking about Brother Benjamin Franklin.
Yay.
Who was a very prominent Mason, very, very active, but
it is for is as important to our country as George Washington is. However,
he did something completely different.
Yes.
He was a completely different side of the coin for making our country, but he also had a different upbringing and a different
lifestyle
and a different personality.
Yeah.
His personality is fascinating. So I think the comparison, Brother Washington was very, very serious and very stoic and reserved. And he's exactly what you imagine, the strong, virtued man who could not be follied. He didn't let his vices get the better of him and what have you. Brother Franklin was a little different. And I think, as much as I wish I was like Brother Washington, I think I have a little bit more Brother Franklin in me. So he's absolutely fascinating craftsman. We are looking forward to sharing that one because he has a very interesting history Masonically and in the creation of our country. But to top everything off, if you really want to know how Brother Washington felt about our fraternity, if anybody ever had any doubts to his feelings for everything, he wrote a letter to King David's Lodge in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790. And this is what he had to say. Being persuaded that a just application of the principles on which the Masonic fraternity is founded must be promotive of private virtue and public prosperity, I shall always be happy to advance the interests of the society and to be considered by them as a deserving brother. And I think that is the ultimate test of a Mason, of saying it's not the title, it's all the great things he's had in his life. What's important to him is that he is considered a deserving brother by his brethren. And I think that that's an honor that we all share and we all hope to have that acceptance. So, Brother Washington, if you're listening up there, you're still that deserving brother, and we hope that we're as deserving of it as you were. So, thank you, Craftsman, for joining us today on the Third Degree Masonic Podcast. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode, where we will go over the life of the iconic Mason, Brother Benjamin Franklin. Brother Gabriel, do you have anything for closing out?
I don't think I have anything else.
All right. Well, Craftsman, as always,
keep your working tools in order.
And always be on the level. Take care, Craftsman.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the Grand Lodge of Ohio, its officers, or any of its jurisdictions. They only reflect those of the hosts or guests.